close-up view of the site. And I do work for Cornell's Integrated Pest Management Program, and we provide information for growers of a variety of crops and for residents, everybody who is dealing with pests in some way or another in New York State. And we're part of the Cornell extension system. So spotted lanternfly, it's around, it's here now in downstate New York. And let's talk a little bit about its background, and then we'll look into how this pest feeds and how it gets around. And yeah, plenty of time for your questions too. But it is native to Asia. It came over accidentally in 2014. It seems like it came in either with eggs that were laid on a pallet or actually on stone that was being imported. So Berks County, Pennsylvania was the first location to have that, and that's just north of Philadelphia in that region. Not too far away really from New York City, but it took a while to get to us. It wasn't until 2020 when it first was detected in New York State, and that was on Staten Island. But it feeds on over 100 different plant species. And if I was talking to you a year or two ago, that list might have been 50 or 75. The more we learn about this, the more we know this insect will feed on just about anything. The one exception is the evergreens, conifers. We don't see it feeding on there. And they have a different vascular system. Their pipe work is different. This insect feeds on that. So that's probably why that's not an acceptable host. But its preferred host is the tree of heaven. We're going to take a close look at that in a little bit. But it also likes black walnuts, willow, red maples, and grapes. It's an important reason why we're concerned about it in New York State. But yeah, there's over 100 plant species that it can feed on. We'll talk about those too. But just a little bit about where it was globally. It was native to this part of Asia. And it was actually introduced to Korea. So it became a problem several years ago in South Korea. We became aware of it, and it spread very quickly there. So we had a little bit of heads up on this. And so when it was introduced to Pennsylvania, they took quick action, were able to get some quarantines placed, and that seems to have slowed it down. Now it has spread certainly, but the spread could have been a lot quicker. Here's where it's at now, and this is as of September 1st. We continually update this map. Our New York State IPM program houses the national map for spotted lanternfly, and we receive information when a new county becomes infested. In fact, we'll be adding another county to Ohio in the next version of this map later this month. But here we can look at New York State, and in addition, we have this map, which serves kind of as a heat map to let us know, even though an entire county is colored in, you can see it's much more severe in downstate New York City, not so far out on Suffolk County. Is present there, but not widespread. And then it is moving up, and the two most recent counties on this map that have been declared as infested are Putnam and Dutchess County. And I understand in Westchester, it is the southern end of Westchester has more infestations than the northern end. But that will change because this insect does get around. And then we'll talk about the pathways and spreads that spreading avenues that allow this insect to move. And they are clumsy flyers, but they can get around with human activity. This was a shot in Rockland County at a truck outside of an area where there's a garden center, and you can see the spotted lanternfly were attracted to the tires there. And yeah, they can get into vehicles, and the adults can move around in that way. And they can also get on rail cars, and their egg masses can spread through movement. Here's a picture that was taken outside of Philadelphia. If you take a close look at this car This was actually the car in front of me. Now, my wife was driving, so I'm not taking photos while I'm driving, but take a look there. There's a spotted lanternfly on the car, and it was a couple light cycles before we moved through. We saw that go into the crack here between the trunk and the car, and it didn't stay there, but you know, they can do that. And there have been reports even of in New York, in counties that don't have spotted lanternfly, where somebody was in a zone that has them. They opened up their trunk, and sure enough, there's a spotted lanternfly or two that did get in, probably when they had their trunk open, putting luggage or things in there. But we do see it move around. Here is one of the places that we commonly see it first in an area is along rail lines. And I took this little video of spotted lanternfly here, and a train coming on there. And so it could be that the adults would get onto the train, but also we get concerned about egg masses that might be laid on the rail cars, especially on rail sidings where the cars are parked. And so those rail corridors are, as I mentioned, one of the first places we find them in a new area. And when we think about where they are and where they could be, we get concerned in New York State because we have a big grape and wine industry with over 470 wineries in New York, 900 grape farms, 35,000 acres of vineyards. So it's an important economic sector for New York. And it also brings in tourism as well. So in the lower Hudson Valley last year, we had our first spotted lanternfly show up in a vineyard. And, you know, we're keeping our eyes out for it because sadly it has killed vineyards in Pennsylvania. But we've learned from that. Pennsylvania has been great. Penn State University researchers have shared a lot of information. We feel we're positioned well not to lose grapevines and vineyards, but it is something that we're concerned about. And here you can see some of the spotted lanternfly on grapevines, and this is close to harvest. This is right at this time of year. And you'll notice they're not interested in the grapes at all. It is, or the foliage, they're right on the vines because they're tapping into the xylem and the phloem inside those stems. And this is sadly a result of spotted lanternfly feeding that went unchecked early on during the infestation in Pennsylvania. And this is in the springtime, the vines did not make it through dormancy there. And another one that happened a few years ago in 2019. And taking a look at the vineyards, if you take a close look here, the spotted lanternfly are at the base of the vine. So they were sprayed and the spotted lanternfly died there. But because they have so many host plants, they can come back in and reinfest those vines. So continued scouting is required and possible multiple applications of an insecticide. This is the first spotted lanternfly that was detected in a vineyard in Orange County. And this is a good thing that it's being monitored closely, and we know when this is happening. And an alert went out to Hudson Valley growers, and now scouting is really key. And this year we've already seen some additional vineyards that have spotted lanternfly. This is how bad it can be, and you can imagine that this is removing a lot of nutrients from that vine there, and you could imagine that the mortality would follow. This was in Pennsylvania last fall, with the vines just covered in spotted lanternfly. And it's not every vine in the vineyard. It tends to show up more on the edges, closer to hedgerows. And just another shot in the grapevines and on apple trees. But it's not a serious problem on apple trees. They'll come in, they can look like this, but you know what? They quickly move away. This insect likes to feed on many different crops. It doesn't like to hang out on apples. So it's not causing damage to the trees or the fruit, even though that looks really dramatic. The reports where they've been watching this from Pennsylvania for several years have shown no impacts yet on apples. So I hope that stays. Once in a while, we'll see the nymphs. We'll take a look at the life stages so you can see what it looks like through the growing season. But these are the nymph stages of the same insect. And here they are on cucumbers. And this was on Staten Island at Snug Harbor there in an urban farm. And here it is on okra. So cucumbers and okra were affected there last year. This year, it's a little bit, they're seeing a little bit less of the spotted lanternfly. And that's kind of the way it works. It does peak and then go down. And they first had spotted lanternfly on Staten Island in 2020. So here we are, 2023. It already seems like the populations are going down a bit on Staten Island. And their one solution here that they used was a vacuum, and you may have heard about vacuums being used. This is a little video. They can see a solution there, pesticide-free, and pretty effective to remove those nymphs without concern of pesticide contaminating the pods that look like they're ready to pick there. Okay, let's go. Here we go. So there it is on vegetables. We talked about it on grapes and apples a little bit. But this is where you're most likely to see spotted lanternfly. This is a weedy tree that self-seeds. You're not going to find this at any nursery. It is an invasive species on its own, and it is actually from the area where spotted lanternfly occurs naturally. So this was here for over a century in North America, and it is, spread up and down the East Coast and inland. And now, with spotted lanternfly introduced, it has its natural host plant, and it does very well when it has access to that. At one point, we were thinking that it was required for spotted lanternfly to have this. In laboratory type settings, we find that you can raise spotted lanternfly without it, but when it has access to the tree of heaven or Ailanthus, it lays 7 times the number of eggs, and it begins laying eggs weeks earlier than it would without it. And here's one leaf, and this is a yardstick, so you can see the leaves can get very big. They have multiple leaflets on it, so it's pinnately compound. And at the base of those leaflets, we have these lobes here, and these are characteristic of the tree of heaven. Black walnut, that also has pinnately compound leaves, does not have these lobes. Another way to identify it is to crush up the leaves, and they have a strong odor. It smells a little bit like peanut butter. At this time of year, you can also see the seed heads on the female. There are male and female trees. The female trees have these seed heads that are quite visible. Took some photos recently. This is one in upstate New York, and the flowers are out. You can see the seeds, and those seeds, even after the leaves fall, the seed heads will cling on there throughout the winter. They'll lose some of that red color, and they'll just be tan. This was last week in Brooklyn. I happened to walk past a Ailanthus that had spotted lanternfly on it. It was down here on the trunk and in the canopy. And the reason I know they were up in the canopy is because it felt like it was raining when it wasn't outside, and that was their honeydew coming down. And then on the right here, there is just another tree where you can see the seed heads there. But we might think, well, there's such an association. Should we get rid of our tree of heaven? Unfortunately, cutting it down won't kill it. It does sprout from the base, and you can actually have more in a few years if you cut it and don't use an herbicide. And that new growth happens to be very attractive to the nymphal stages, and it's like food for them. So the best way to manage it then is to not just cut it down like this and allow the root sprouts to develop, but rather use a technique like hack and squirt, where the tree is injured, which allows the direct application of an herbicide to the vascular tissue. And in that way, the roots and the top have time to die, and the tree doesn't send up new sprouts. All right, let's talk about what's happening. So we saw some of these. You may have noticed them out in the landscape earlier in the summer. We saw some images of it, but right now we'll start at where we are right now. We've got the adults that emerged in July or early August, and soon they will begin laying eggs. Later this month, it happens to be normally right around the equinox. I think the first one was September 20th in New York State last year. So in a couple of weeks, we'll see the egg laying begin. And that can continue through October, even early November. They are then killed off by the first hard freeze. The adults are, but the eggs survive. The eggs can survive sub-zero temperatures. And then again in May, depending on how warm the spring is, sometime around mid-May, synchronized with the expansion of leaves on shrubs and trees, the young nymphs emerge. They go through different molts. We call those instars, shedding their skin at each step and becoming larger, till finally they reach this fourth instar stage where they have a red pigment to them, and they continue to feed in that stage. Eventually, in July or mid-August, they develop a slit on the backside, and out crawls the adult spotted lanternfly. The wings expand pretty quickly, and they begin feeding again until they're killed by the first hard freeze. And here's just the same view where you can see it in a linear fashion. They hatch in May, look like this, and stick around with us through December. Here are the spotted lanternfly egg masses. This is what survives the winter. The adults will be killed by those cold temperatures. And as I mentioned, in 2022, it was on September 20th. And we have yet to see the first egg masses for this year. Here you can see them laying some fresh egg masses. So here are the females. They first start out with this light color, and then they age to a gray, covering that's over top of them. And you can see in time that cracks a little bit. They generally cover most of their eggs, but sometimes the eggs are left uncovered. They can still survive the winter, but they're more vulnerable to being eaten by another insect or something else that might find them attractive. And here you can see these are individual eggs all lined up, and they're lined up generally in about an inch long line. And there's generally about 30 to 40 eggs in any one egg mass, and a female can lay 3 or 4 egg masses in her lifetime. And where are those egg masses laid? Well, you can see from this picture on nearly anything. We used to say, by the way, that they could be laid on any hard surface. Now it's any surface. You can leave a ball cap outside. There's pictures of lawn furniture with the cushions that have spotted lanternfly egg masses on them. So these egg masses were laid. This chair was on its side, and it was leaned up against the tree for this photo. So they lay them on the undersides, and even this post, it had a lean to it, and so it was on the underside of that angle that they laid their egg masses on. On rocks, look for the edge that might be towards the ground. And here is after those egg masses hatch. You can see the young that crawl out first there, this gray color. This is a little video. I happened to be in Pennsylvania in mid-May and caught this happening. They're not all synchronized. The egg masses that are in a warmer spot of a yard or a landscape will hatch earlier than those in a cooler area. And shortly after they hatch, they develop this dark black pigment with the white spots. That's just another shot of them. And eventually, as I mentioned, they get to be at this 4th instar stage, and that's where that slit develops on the backside, and the adults climb out. The adults are about an inch long and pretty recognizable here, but they can be camouflaged on certain plants like this red maple. There are some over here. See if you can see those. I'll put some arrows up here so you can see if you found them all. So there they are. So for a polka dotted insect that has red underwings, they can be a little bit camouflaged on tree bark. And if you see them in a new area, and for Westchester County, don't need to report them anymore. For New York City, all the boroughs, reporting is not necessary. But for areas upstate, New York State Ag and Market still wants reporting to occur. Especially we're concerned about some of the upstate growing, grape growing regions, Finger Lakes, and in the Erie County area. So that is a report portal. Also, if you go to our New York State IPM Spider Lanternfly web pages, we have a link to that. So let's take a close look at this insect. Here's one flipped over on her backside, and we can see the right here in the center, the business part of this insect. This insect feeds with a piercing and sucking mouth part, so it puts that well into the tree. It can go right through the tree bark, and it knows, it has sensors on the end, so it knows to go at the xylem and the phloem, and it can actually move between the two to its advantage, bringing in lots of fluid from the plant. Some of it's relying on the pressure within the plant, that turgor pressure, to force liquid through the body. It filters out what it wants, and then it excretes from this end honeydew. So that's a waste product for that insect, and that can be a nuisance for us. Here we can see it feeding on grapevines, and this is a little video. You're going to see some of that honeydew dripping down here. This is what I experienced last week in Brooklyn, not on grapes, but on a tree of heaven. But take a look at this insect. We're going to see that honeydew being expelled there. Can you see that coming out? So you can imagine that that's going to be removing a lot of sugars from that plant, and that can make it so it's weakened and it's difficult for that plant to survive the winter. And this can be the result of a lot of spider lanternfly feeding above. So there's a tree above these steps, and this bottom one was cleaned with a power washer, but you can see these top two that were coated with honeydew. And then the dark material is a sooty mold that is taking advantage of that honeydew as a food source. And once in a while, we'll see a certain tree for some reason become very attractive late in the season, generally around October, and this can happen. This doesn't happen to every in every house in a neighborhood, but it does show up once in a while. And because there's a lot of honeydew, we can see honeybees and yellow jackets. Instead of going to fall blooming flowers, they're getting their nectar from spotted lanternfly in the form of honeydew. So that can be a nuisance. And yeah, it has captured people's attention. And this is from last year. We saw a lot of headlines in New York City and the Hudson Valley area, including this from the New York Post. Of course, they have to have their own spin to this, and it has made the news this year. Last Sunday's New York Times, actually, I guess 2 weeks ago now, the Sunday New York Times had an article actually on the front page below the fold on spotted lanternfly. And in Pennsylvania, they were getting the word out about this. And, you know, I think a lot of New Yorkers have the word too, that if you can step on it, you're preventing those spotted lanternfly from laying eggs, and it can help reduce it, and it increases our awareness so that we're not moving it as well. But there was such a concern in Pennsylvania that the Philadelphia Inquirer, their main newspaper there, had to run a story saying, please don't call 911 to report spotted lanternfly invasions. And it can cause a lot of concern. However, if you see something like this is actually my brother's house in Pennsylvania. And in the fall, he saw a lot of spotted lanternfly on a maple that was out by where he parks his truck. And over the summer, he was noticing some spots on the truck, and that's the honeydew. It's just sugar water. It doesn't damage the paint at all. It can be easily washed off. But yeah, when it's on the windshield, it can be annoying. But my sister-in-law posted these pictures on Facebook and got a lot of responses. So people feel very strongly about this and have opinions. A lot of them are not what we would recommend. So please, no one, don't use a blowtorch. We're going to ask you not to do that. There's some home remedies that we're not going to recommend. And there's some thoughts, you know, they're not killing blue spruce. That was something else. These are not a pest of conifers, as I mentioned before. So this is some really important information that we like to get out. You know, we have to remind everyone that they don't bite, they don't sting, they're not structural pests. We actually did some research last year, brought them inside to see at room temperature how long they could survive. And the longest was just a little bit over 48 hours. So just beyond 2 days, they're going to die. They continually need to feed. If not, they desiccate. And they don't harm landscape trees. So that tree of my brother's there in his front yard, it's fine. It's fine. It did not suffer any damage from that feeding. The exception might be if you happen to have an ailanthus tree there. It's not too common to have those in our landscape, but they are something that's around. They can suffer a little bit from the spotted lanternfly feeding, but any of our trees that you're going to find in a nursery and most of our landscapes are going to be just fine. If you have backyard grapes, you're going to want to manage those, the spotted lanternfly if they're occurring in those as well. And we'll talk about some of the resources and how we might manage the spotted lanternfly. This is the New York State Integrated Pest Management Spotted Lanternfly webpage, and we have a lot of information that links out from here. So please feel free to visit this. And if you just do a search on, you know, spotted lanternfly, New York State IPM, it will come up right near the top. So at this page, we have information about stopping the spread, the biology, you know, kind of a review of what I talked about tonight. Reporting, if you're in an area that doesn't have spotted lanternfly and you'd like to report it, you can click there. The damage it can cause, really focusing on grapes there, and then managing spotted lanternfly. If you click on that, you're going to see these options. So you can learn more about traps, how to destroy the egg masses, trap trees, sticky bands, insecticides, vacuum removal. So lots of options there. We're just going to take a look at a couple, and I've got the traps highlighted there. So that's what we'll look at here. So there are some really effective spotted lanternfly traps. And Jacob here, who works in our program, is by a circle trap here. And you can purchase these online. If you look for spotted lanternfly circle trap, you'll find these. Or there's some good videos online. Penn State has a good video that's linked on how you can make one yourself. And they take advantage of the spotted lanternfly's behavior in continuing to climb up tree trunks. So they'll fly for a little bit. They are clumsy flyers. They don't get very far. They'll end up on the ground again and then climb up a tree. If it's in an urban or suburban setting, sometimes they're climbing up the side of a building. In the city, they're climbing up the apartment buildings getting up quite high, or even the side of our houses. But that's their drive, is to climb up. This takes advantage of that and funnels them in. So this wraps around the tree trunk and then funnels them in to a bag. Once they're in, they continue to try to go up so they don't climb back down and get out, and they end up there. And this is a picture that I took at the end of August when I was in the Bronx there for an event, letting people know about spotted lanternfly and what they could do about it. I set this up in the morning on a tree in a park, and within a couple of hours I had 3 spotted lanternfly there. Didn't notice any spotted lanternfly on that tree, knew they were in the area, but I chose that tree because it was near where we were speaking. So very effective in a short period of time. And if you have a lot in your area, you're going to need to change those bags probably on a weekly basis. So there are these circle traps. There's also sticky traps. This is one that has the sticky material on the inside, not on the outside, and that helps prevent bycatch, where we could unintendedly capture other beneficial animals and pests. And so this is a sticky trap that has a wire cage around it, and that is to prevent birds, for example, getting in there, because a bird can see these, like a woodpecker, see these spotted lanternfly there and like, oh, I want to eat an insect. It comes in, and sadly, there are pictures out there of woodpeckers that have been trapped on these sticky traps. So we always want to have a barrier like this. I've used a screen barrier, like you can see lifted up here, and you can just put that on with thumbtacks right after you wrap that sticky material around. Pretty easy to do, and then it protects against that unintended bycatch of birds. And here is again that bug barrier with the sticky material on the inside. It's not put against the bark. There is a band of foam that goes around to keep it away from the bark, but the spotted lanternfly climb up here and then get stuck on the inside. There also are labeled insecticides for spotted lanternfly. So if you click on that page, you can see what is registered for use in New York State. Rarely is it going to be necessary. As I mentioned, they don't harm us and they don't harm our landscape trees. So, if you can tolerate it, knowing that when we get that first hard freeze in the fall, they're going to die. And eventually, after a couple of years, the populations will decline. You may not need to use insecticide. So, but if you do choose to do that, there are products that are labeled there, and you can see those on our website. And of course, our grape growers have different commercial products that are available to them, and they have their own list that's clickable. Just a little bit about some of the work that's taking place at Cornell with spotted lanternfly. The Cornell extension system is engaged, and we have people like Hillary and Amy in Westchester County that are working, also engaging their master gardeners, and are a good local source for information. Our New York State IPM program is doing some statewide outreach. We had a spotted lanternfly workshop back in the spring of this year where we brought in people from several different states and even Canada, where they're concerned about spotted lanternfly, and talked about some of the research that's taking place and some of the research that's needed, because this is a new insect really to science. It wasn't a problem in Asia. There's a lot of research taking place so that we can catch up and answer some of the questions that will help manage this in the future. The Cornell entomology department is working on biological control, and I'm going to show you a couple pictures of that. And Northeastern IPM is kind of coordinating some of our local work on this. And we also have pesticide guidelines from Cornell department as well. There's been outreach to growers and some field surveys being done there. But here is a little bit of hope for the future, some light at the end of the tunnel. In some cases in Pennsylvania where they've had spotted lanternfly for a while, they started to see these fungi killing spotted lanternfly where their populations were very high. So this one happens to be a fungus called Bavaria bassiana, and that was brought back to Cornell Labs. This is a postdoc that was working there at Cornell and headed up some of this research on these entomopathic fungi, and including Bavaria and Bacoa here, both fungi that are killing it. And so the idea is that these in the future may be turned into a natural biological insecticide that will help control spotted lanternfly. It's occurring at a low level right now in nature, but if it could be turned into a spray treatment, that would be some good hope for the future. Here is another fungus. This one occurs at really low levels, but this one only is known to feed on spotted lanternfly. And this was actually discovered, and the fungus was named by Eric Clifton there at Cornell a couple of years ago. Other animals will feed on spotted lanternfly, and they tend to figure this out a couple of years after it is in a new area. Chickens, and so this research was done through a citizen science project where photos were taken of spotted lanternfly being consumed, in this case by birds, but they looked at other categories as well. So chickens were, but I talked to somebody in Brooklyn who had backyard chickens, and their chickens were ignoring the spotted lanternfly. So it's not 100%, but it does happen. Cardinals, catbirds, blue jays, tufted titmice will feed on them. And arthropods, so our insects and spiders, praying mantis, and it seems like the praying mantis populations in Pennsylvania have increased with the increased presence of spotted lanternfly. So some natural biological control taking place there on the insect end. Some yellow jackets have been found eating spotted lanternfly. Spiders, this was orb weaver, but other spiders as well. Some of this is taking place in the duff, in the grass layer that we can't even see. So there's probably a lot more spider activity than we know of. And wheel bugs, these are an interesting insect. I have personally seen more of these in parts of Pennsylvania where they have spotted lanternfly, and I think their populations have elevated because they have this new food source. Ants too have been found feeding on spotted lanternfly. Maybe the dead ones, we're not sure if they are actually killing them, but these other insects are actually killing and feeding on them. The most reported predator, probably because it's the most visible, sitting on the end of branches, is the praying mantis. And also fish, and some of this, was taking place in aquariums. Again, this is citizen science project. Yeah, we have the African cichlid there, but even some of the game fish are feeding on it, like bass and trout. And they've seen frogs, toads, garter snakes, and brown snakes feeding on spotted lanternfly. After the spotted lanternfly are there in big numbers for a while, it's hard for nature to ignore that, and they find it as a food source. Even some mammals and dogs and cats will feed on spotted lanternfly. They often won't keep it down. It's not because there's a toxin in the spotted lanternfly that we know of. It's just that it's an irritant, and that's what dogs and cats do sometimes. Like this, yes, toddlers will stick anything in their mouths, even spotted lanternfly sometimes. So that wraps up what I have. We have a good amount of time here for questions. If you have any, we're happy to take those.
Thank you, Brian. And I do think it's funny the amount of times that I have gotten pictures and videos of praying mantis eating spotted lanternfly
Okay, good.
has gone through the roof. Do they feed on hops?
Oh, yes. Yes, they do feed on hops. We have yet to determine how much of an impact they have. We were concerned really early on when we saw them on the hop plants, but they don't kill hops plants. We know that for sure. So unlike grapes, the plants are going to be able to survive even a severe infestation, but they may reduce yields in further years. So good question. Yeah, so our wine and potentially our beer with hops there could be impacted by spotted lanternfly.
And then there was another comment that someone said that they've seen katydid eat the spotted lanternflies.
Oh, well, that's interesting. I haven't heard of that, but good to know. Like I mentioned, when you get so many insects out there, it's hard for nature to ignore it, and something's going to find it as a food source. So maybe even katydids.
And this person is kind of, I guess, just corroborating what you're saying. They said that they put up bird feeders um, to have more of a bird presence in their backyard because they have some spotted lanternfly, a lot
Ah,
of spotted lanternfly. And she says she believes it's working. It might be anecdotal, but she's hoping it works. And that goes along nicely with the list of birds that you say could potentially eat them.
that I have not heard of that before. I like that. We know in some agricultural settings that hummingbirds, for example, will feed on some of the fruit flies, and they have put hummingbird feeders up and have seen a reduction in fruit flies in those fields. So, hey, maybe the same thing could happen with spotted lanternfly. Thanks for sharing that.
Someone's asking to hack and squirt. What do you squirt with?
Yeah, so you would want to use a registered herbicide for that that case, and so an active ingredient of glyphosate or I'm trying to think, triclopyr are often used for these total um, kill of a plant, and so those are non-selective. So you want to make sure that you're getting on to the target plant and not getting it on anything else in the landscape. And there will be instructions on the label, and you want to follow those exactly to make your application.
And there's a few questions, general help me questions. So it seems, and I think from what I've taken from the program, they're saying I have a ton of spotted lanternfly in my backyard, in my terrace, on my terrace, New York City, on the 16th floor. What do I do? And like I'm just echoing what you said. I believe, a good IPM approach. There's pesticides, there's traps that can be used. It's a multi-tier hope of getting
There
rid.
is, and we saw early on the use of a vacuum. In some settings, that can be really your first line of defense on a patio, for example. Getting that vacuum out there and just sucking them off doesn't mean that they won't come back, because these things do like to move around. But you do that one or two times, and you might be through the end of the growing season where we're not going to see them anymore. So you just would want to empty that vacuum bag after a while, because they can rot if you suck up a lot of them, and that's not a pleasant thing.
And I know actually even Westchester County Parks just purchased, I think, 10 backpack vacuums. So that's something that they're definitely getting behind here in Westchester.
Yes, and when you do that with the adults before they start laying eggs, you're helping eliminate next year's problem too.
There is a question, since spotted lanternfly are from China, how did they handle them there? What did they
Yeah,
need?
that is a great question. I got to say that they are not invasive there. It's hard to find spotted lanternfly in China, and that's probably because there are a lot of predators that are native to that area, including other insects that naturally feed on them. So they're kept in check. Everything is in balance there in their native habitat. But with so many invasive species, you take it out of its native habitat, and it has no predators and the populations can explode like they have here. I have to say that the the researchers in China were very welcoming. This was actually before the pandemic. They invited researchers from Penn State over, from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And what they found was a couple of insects that feed on spotted lanternfly in those areas. They brought them back to the U.S. and they are in isolation labs to make sure that those insects that could be possible biological controls don't feed on any of our native insects. So we don't want to release something that would have an unintended impact. But there is some more potential for biological control in addition to the fungi.
Okay, and there's a few questions, and I think you summed it up just now about different pathogens, different biological controls. So there's a lot of research being done. So that's really awesome to know that things are up and coming in that end. And then the question of the night, Brian, will spraying vinegar and liquid soap on them help?
Yeah, so those are not tested products. So I can't say, 100% on that, but, they're not registered insecticides, and used in that way, they would be considered insecticides. And our Department of Environmental Conservation says that, we can't recommend something that is not a registered pesticide. So, yeah, that's my answer. Hillary, I don't know if you have any
I'll
other.
piggyback on that one a little bit.
Yeah,
So
please.
the vinegar sprays, if you use a horticultural vinegar,
Oh,
it's
good.
actually an herbicide. So you are doing nothing probably but bathing the spotted lanternfly, but you could be causing a lot of burning on the plants that you're spraying it on, hoping to fix the problem. um, and the egg masses, how do you kill the egg masses? What can be done? How do you
Good,
handle those?
good question. Here we can see on the right there a spotted lanternfly that's laying an egg mass. They adhere pretty tightly to the bark or whatever they're on. As I mentioned, they can occur on anything. So it takes a little bit of effort, like a credit card, something, a putty knife, whatever you have, to scrape those off. And there you want to put them in a plastic bag. If they were scraped to the ground, probably they would be consumed by other insects down there, but you don't want to take any chances. You want to scrape that and then put it in a bag and crush them. You can pop them like tiny bubble wrap, and they squish out, and that way you know that they're killed. Or yeah, you can just seal them up and make sure that they are disposed of. And sometimes if it's on a hard surface, you could actually crush them on site with the head of a hammer, or just by pressing really hard.
And this was an interesting one. So spotted lanternfly have established populations in Colorado, and this person was wondering if there might be any biological or behavioral differences between eastern and western populations.
Yeah, well, they are as far west as Indiana right now. I didn't know that they were in Colorado, but it is a good question. And it looks like all of the spotted lanternfly from the genetic tests that they have done so far are all originating from that spot north of Philadelphia where they originally came in, and that there haven't been separate introductions. There was just that one introduction, and it spread from there.
And so we do have a couple more minutes, and we're happy to go over to get some of these questions answered. I will just pause really fast and say, if you are here for credits, make sure you get your name in the chat before you head out. If you are heading out soon, thank you very much for coming. But let's keep going. There's a question about Tree of Heaven. This person has a strong opinion of them. Said, could it be an ironic benefit that the spotted lanternfly will kill the tree, And like, what about like having them as a trap crop or getting rid of
Yeah.
them all together? What's the idea on that?
Yeah. So it in some parts of Pennsylvania where they've had spotted lanternfly long enough, it has actually killed some of the ailanthus or tree of heaven plants. So, and then they're seeing a decline in the population of spotted lanternfly because it's such an important host for it. So it is possible to for that to happen, and we do consider it mostly a weed species, although in some urban areas it might be the only tree in an area or a street tree that does become important uh, for us there.
Awesome. And there are a few questions about community gardens or areas that are home developments that have different wooded areas. Uh,
Hmm.
might need to be organic or, doesn't have the ability to use a lot of pesticides. What other than stomping would you say is like the vacuums and things of that nature to help out?
Yeah, well, let's talk about the wooded areas a little bit because what we've found in the wooded areas or forest, it's mostly a problem around the perimeter. They don't like to go in too far into the center. Even if there's maples or willows in there, they tend to be a species that stays along the edge. And maybe it's because they crawl, and when they're younger, they like more of the herbaceous type of host plants to feed upon. Uh, and we generally, in those forest settings, we just don't need to control them. They're a little bit of a nuisance, but they're not going to harm those large trees.
And when you're scouting and looking for these egg masses, where are they? Is there a certain height that you should look for
Mm,
them? Where are they usually in the trees or on camping chairs or on drums or
yeah,
bridges?
that is a really good question. I'm glad that was brought up because they can be found. A study was done in Pennsylvania a couple of years ago where we were looking at can scraping them be our control measure because that's a point where we can remove the potential for next year. They sacrificed an entire tree. It was a maple tree in an area, and they started counting egg masses. And sadly, they found that 80% of the egg masses were above 10 feet in height. And, maybe you're a 6 foot person, about 10 feet is the farthest you could reach without a ladder. And so most of the egg masses on any tree that has some size to it are out of reach. So that's something for to keep in mind. And then down on the ground, they're going to be, as I kind of was mentioning, on the underside of whatever is out there. So it's kind of like looking for Easter eggs, lifting things up and looking underneath them to find those egg masses and destroying them. And then, yeah, please, if you're in an area, you have spotted lanternfly in your backyard, they may have laid an egg mass. We really don't want you to take anything from that backyard to an area that doesn't have spotted lanternfly. That actually happened. A farm moved in the winter from an area in Pennsylvania to Indiana, and that sadly they brought spotted lanternfly with them, and it's the only spotted lanternfly infestation around. It didn't move naturally on its own that far west. It's an isolated population, so that could happen for us in upstate New York or across the country.
And that does include firewood as well.
Absolutely, a
Is
good point. There's many reasons we don't want to move firewood. This is just one more.
And so when you say that the spotted lanternfly will not kill landscape trees, are we really only thinking that it'll do severe damage to something like grapes and tree of heaven?
Yeah, that is what we've seen. Even when we see that congregation happening on a maple tree or a willow, those trees are fine. There was one case in Pennsylvania where a branch in the upper canopy was covered with spotted lanternfly, as we've seen, and there was a little bit of dieback, but the rest of the tree was fine. So yeah, that we're just not seeing it on those trees, even with that dramatic feeding. I think there's enough reserves in the a healthy tree otherwise that they can handle losing some of the sap to the spotted lanternfly, unlike a grapevine that doesn't have the big reserves, and some of those are marginally hardy as well.
And speaking of grapevines, do grape growers, do you know if they have any success with excluding with bird netting?
They have used some netting in Pennsylvania where they're putting the netting up at the edge of the vineyard, near those treed areas where often the spotted lanternflies are climbing up to the top of the tree and then kind of gliding down towards the vineyards. So they've put them up there. They've had some success with that. And this is a very fine netting, because it has to intercept the flying spotted lanternfly. It's not just, kind of like a fence. And it is expensive, obviously, to have these really high nets up there, but there has been some success with that in a vineyard setting. It's not a blanket recommendation. It would have to fit into that grower's operation.
And what did they think about the speed that this is going to spread through the north and south or across the country? Is there anything that they feel might hinder its movement or?
Yeah, it's a good question. And we've been learning as we go here because it like I said, is relatively new to science. It spreading on its own, it can only fly up about the maximum of about 4 miles in its lifetime. So that's a pretty slow spread, right? But it has been found along rail lines. Probably egg masses were laid on rail cars, and then they were in a new area when the eggs hatched in the spring. And so I think Binghamton, Syracuse, and Buffalo's infestations all were centered near rail lines or rail sidings where boxcars would be sitting. And it hasn't been found on the West Coast in the grape growing regions there where the habitat looks suitable for it. So that's good news. It's hard to know exactly how fast it would spread, but there are some models out there. There's an eco lab, if you Google that, that's out of Temple University that has some models on the possible range expansion, but much of that doesn't account for human movement, just movement on its own. But yeah, eventually it does look like this will spread throughout the suitable areas in New York State. Some parts of New York State will not have a growing season that's long enough, like the Adirondacks. The growing season seems to be too short to be able to accommodate this insect that hatches in May and doesn't lay eggs until the end of September. Oftentimes there might be a frost in between there at some of the higher elevations, and the egg hatch would occur later in the season.
So I'm going to group a couple together.
Okay.
There are more questions about treatment. So someone brought up the Harris product that we were talking about before we started. People are saying, what if I use alcohol? Is there any 25B products that can be used? What if I put a jar over them? Will they suffocate? I guess so. Just a broad stroke about home remedies, pesticides, common things that people might do that do work or don't work, and maybe a plug to your website where you have it all.
Yeah, please. That's a good place to start. And somebody mentioned the 25B. So that's a special exemption for a new pest, and that gets a fast track approval. We have some of those listed on our website. And if somebody's asking about 25B, they might be a commercial applicator. And what is available as a restricted use for commercial applicators is a greater list than what is available to individual residents who are not certified to apply insecticides. And there are some, I didn't mention, there are some systemic insecticides that a homeowner could have a commercial applicator apply to their tree that's taken up systemically. And because of that, you're not spraying it on, you're not getting drift onto other plants, and only something that's feeding on that tree will take in that insecticide. So that's a relatively safe way to have an application take place. And that's going to be done by a commercial applicator. What else, Hillary? And maybe you have, again, some opinions on this or some advice, because you've been handling it there in Westchester.
Yeah, so there's a lot of questions, like we have been saying, about killing the eggs. So like you said, if it's a hard surface, you can like hit it with a hammer or squish it. I've also heard like a credit card or something to scrape them off, like you had said. Um, and the different horticultural oils and things like that are on, you have the list of everything that's labeled for use in New York State, and they can get that through your website, but we also have that on our website, so you can get it to either way.
Yeah, the alcohol you mentioned, I mean, that's you have to be careful because that's not a registered pesticide. We can hose it down. The DEC allows that, and that will knock them off, at least temporarily. And if they're on a tree and they're, excreting honeydew and it's a nuisance, go ahead and hose them down and knock them off the tree.
So I think that we will ask one more question. We'll end it on a fun question, but I will say thank you everyone for coming. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to CCE Westchester. We're happy to help. You can call us or email if you have any questions about identifying or treatment or anything, any kind of questions about will a product work, or what should I do, we're more than happy to help you. We will put this on our website as well. So this presentation you'll be able to look at over and over and send it to all your neighbors when you figure out what's going on, if you have some. And I think we should have a fun one to end with. Someone's asking about Dia and the other pups that they use for detection.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So they do have dogs, they say that dogs see in black and white and smell and color. They are able to pick up these fine scents. And apparently spotted lanternfly has one of those scents that dogs can detect, but we can't. And dogs have been trained to pick up that scent and lead us to new infestations with the egg mass and the spotted lanternfly adults. So they've been a good tool to help pick up new infestations of spotted lanternfly.